Okay, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you for joining our third series of NAAAN CONNECT and the conversation that we're hosting today. I just want to show that our opportunity, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to say a few words about our translation. Please sign in on the chat. Let us know that you're here and just say hello so that we know who all will be online with us. This is an informal opportunity and conversation together featuring the leadership of APLU today. But Rebecca, would you like to say something about how we're using Wordly in translation, please?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My colleague Perry will be putting a link in the chat. But if you would like to listen in Spanish or French or another language, please scan this QR code or click the link in the chat. Choose your preferred language, and then you can follow along with subtitles or put in headphones to listen at the same time as well. Additionally, we have translated versions of our slides on our event page in Spanish and in French. My colleague Perry will also put the link for that in the chat as well. If you have any questions about translation throughout, please feel free to message us in the chat and we can assist you.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Just as background, this is our third conversation on NAAAN CONNECT for this year. We featured women in agribusiness and agriculture for Mexico in March. And we featured in June the National Circle for Indigenous Agriculture and Food, NCIAF, out of Canada. And we're fortunate now to be featuring the Association of Public Land-Grant Universities and their role in leadership and extension in the United States for this conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chancellor Tony Frank, who is Chancellor of the Colorado State University System. The CSU system houses the NAAAN Secretariat and has since our inception in 2020. And Chancellor Frank also serves as the steering committee chair for the NAAAN. So over to you, Tony, please.
Thanks, Carrie. Welcome, everyone. We're really glad you're here with us today. As Carrie mentioned, CSU has hosted the NAAAN since it was originally stood up. And a lot of that grew out of suggestions, pushes and prods, perhaps, from then Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack, who felt very strongly that the relationships between the U.S. and Canada and Mexico in particular were critical to helping to meet some of the food-related demands of this part of the world, and in fact, our world on a broader scale. The challenges that we face in agriculture, how to feed the world's population, how to deal with increasing risk of infectious disease to both plants and animals, those are all sorts of issues that don't necessarily recognize national boundaries. And so the partnerships and the teamwork across those boundaries seemed to then Secretary Vilsack and to all of us to be very critical. So CSU was proud to step forward. We had a rich history of international engagement and offer to host the NAAAN. But I think we always knew that to be a good host, you wanted as many people at your table as possible. And one of the key partners that we really thought just had to be here was the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. It's one thing for an individual institution like CSU to try and convene folks and invite them to a meeting. It's another when the organization to which all of us belong steps forward and says, this matters to us as well. So we have always viewed APLU as a critical partner and have always been grateful that they've joined us at this table. Carrie's done a wonderful job in standing up the NAAAN and setting up this NAAAN CONNECT, and we're very pleased today to have the president of APLU, Waded Cruzado, and one of her vice presidents, Doug Steele, join us today, and it's my great pleasure to introduce them both. Waded recently comes from being the president at Montana State University, where she served in that role for 15 years. She was a transformative force at that institution, and by any of a number of parameters, Montana State University is much better off for having had her at that helm. Before that, I knew her when she was in a role at New Mexico State University. She began her career at her alma mater, where she received her bachelor's degree, the University of Puerto Rico at Mayagüez. She received her master's degree from the University of Texas in Arlington, along with her PhD there as well. Doug Steele is the Vice President of Food, Agriculture, and Natural Resources for APLU. Doug was appointed to his position in 2019 and has been a wonderful partner for us here at the NAAAN throughout those years. Doug previously served as a director of the Extension Service at Texas A&M. He was also a vice president for external relations and director of extension at Montana State. And in the small world category, he's also spent time both here and at one of my alma maters at Purdue University. Waded and Doug, it's great to see both of you. Thanks for joining us and being with us today.
Thank you so much, Tony, for having us here. And what a great privilege for Doug and I to have this opportunity to engage in conversation with NAAAN CONNECT. And thank you, Carrie, for this invitation. I think that we have prepared some slides that we can now put forward. I think that many of you are familiar with the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, but I think it will be important for me to give you a little bit more of a background, starting with the fact of, well, how did land-grant universities came to being, which is one of my passions, right? Because when I look back, and I think that up until the 1850s, the landscape of public higher education in America was almost non-existent. In fact, higher education up until that moment was being conducted in the same way and manner as in the old continent, meaning colleges and universities were for the most part private. They had a very narrow set of academic programs, mostly theology and medicine and law. And colleges and universities were reserved for people coming from very wealthy families, particularly men. And so when we talk about this transformation that occurred in 1862, when Congress, after defeating the Morrill Act twice, finally passed a bill, which was absolutely revolutionary, which was, let's open one public university in each state and territory of the Union, right? Today we talk about network and scale. That was network and scale at its best. So the Morrill Act read, let's open one public university in each state and territory of the Union for, and this is a quote, for the purpose of educating the sons and daughters of the industrial classes. So right there, you have, in a nutshell, an incredible transformative experiment, which it's also very inspirational that the third reading passed right in the middle of a civil war in 1862. And so the set of universities that were first created, we call them the 1862s. To that, there will be two additional land-grant bills added to that, one in the 1890s, which opened the door of education to African Americans. And then 100 years later, in 1994, a third land-grant bill opened the door, or it provided the title of land-grant institutions to tribal colleges as well. So now we have this incredible set of universities, and what happened was that we came together in an association established in 1887 with a focus on the tripartite mission of land-grant universities of education and research and extension, right? To increase access among our students, to provide scientific research of incredible excellence, and then to make sure that the knowledge and the education that happened in our labs, in our fields, in our classrooms was also extensive to what were called the non-resident communities, and through that bolstering their economic and community engagement. Next slide. So, as mentioned before, APLU was established in 1887. We're the oldest higher education in America. Right now, we have 250 member institutions. I'm very happy to say that we have institutions from each of those three land grant bills that I mentioned, 1862, 1890s, and 1994. And even more proud also to say that we now have broadened our scope and that we have member institutions from Canada and Mexico and US territories. About 10 years ago, as we know very well, APLU engaged in this wonderful concept of expanding our frontiers through a North American zone of knowledge. And we used APLUs as that catalyst to bring together the expertise from Canada and Mexico and the United States. Next. If you take a look, our footprint is quite impressive. We have 9 Canadian members, 5 Mexican universities, 23 HBCUs, and the list goes on. And that's why our impact is so broad, including 58 of the initial 1862 land grant universities. We are in all 50 states as Congress envisioned that we would be. Next. And again, the impact is tremendous. Let me also pause here when we talk about the number of students we educate, right? Which we educate an incredible number of students and incredible research. I would say also that we need to take back at our history. So in 1862, when we first established these colleges and universities, to actually solve real problems. The most important problem at the time was that the United States had this incredible amount of land, but we did not know how to cultivate it. And so you could almost say that we were a hungry nation, right? Looking for solutions. And now that we open all these universities, well, the thing was we did not have much to teach in terms of agricultural technology. So enter a second bill that was established by Congress, that the Hatch Act, that allowed us to open experimental agricultural stations affiliated to the land grant universities. And that was absolutely transforming in bringing together research and teaching. And then the third important part was in 1914, when again, Congress helped us through the Smith-Lever Act to establish a network, a system called at the time as the Cooperative Extension Program, that would allow us to disseminate the knowledge and the research, the non-biased knowledge that we were gaining through our institutions to every county in the state initially. So we could almost say, right, that thanks to extension, the entire nation became our campus. And today, again, just in terms of research, it's a $61 billion research enterprise that impacts positively not only our students and the graduates, but almost the communities we serve. Next. And so this is where we were talking with Carrie about, and with Tony, about how important and how essential this collaboration with NAAAN is. I need to pause here and say, I know Tony Frank very well, and we have been blessed to have his expertise, not only at Colorado State University system, but beyond. And I want to thank Tony for taken this initiative of advancing this important opportunity to benefit not only the United States, but again, the entire North American continent. So thank you very much, Tony. And with that, we look forward to this conversation. Thank you so much.
I think I'm going to cover two different topics very quickly as we move into the discussion part. First is a little bit more about NAAAN and what NAAAN stands for and how we came to be. And I was fortunate enough to be asked early on to serve on the the guidance committee, the advisory committee, on how to put the structure together and what we were going to do and how we bring people on board. And I was very fortunate, not so much because of who I am, but because who I worked for. There's a great interest in having APLU and the 115 colleges of ag and natural resources you represent as a partner of this. And it's reassuring to look across the participants and see many old-time friends, many new acquaintances in the past couple of years, and see that we do have representation from our 1862s, 1890 historically black serving colleges and universities, and also our 1994s, so tribal colleges and universities. So it's great to have everybody involved. And let me just spend a couple slides on the background to get everybody together about what NAAAN is and what we try to do. And then I want to specifically speak to what we do here at APLU to help support NAAAN, because NAAN's efforts so closely align with what we have for the North America Zone of Knowledge. These are the United Nations Sustainability Goals, and I'm always cautious about putting this up because a lot of people don't look to the United Nations as being national leaders or international leaders, but the sustainability goals don't go away. And in fact, if you look across a lot of these goals, they will not be solved or resolved without agriculture and life sciences being a critical part of this. And if you look at, spend some time and look at the NAAAN website, a little bit about our background and what we propose to do, it really is interconnecting across almost all of these sustainability goals. So it's a good reminder of why we do this work, why it's important, but even more importantly, it gives us a focus for the priority efforts we have going forward. Next, Rebecca. So we know there's a lot of big issues. And I remember the first time that Chancellor Frank and the NAAAN team convened us. We said, what are those big issues that aren't going to be solved by a single country? That's going to take all of this, a collective work, a collective thought, and coming out of the pandemic, the one thing we learned is that, you know, a lot of the issues we face aren't stopped by borders between our countries. They're not stopped by oceans or mountains. It's really become regional geographics in trying to deal with these issues. And so all of our countries faced with how do we feed a growing population with probably not a lot of resources to invest in what we're doing. What does sustainable and economic profitability look like in production agriculture? And being an agriculture advisory network is one of the keys. We have really great basic research, but unless it's not translated to the producer and not adopted by the producer, it's just good research is going to sit on the shelf. So a major proponent of NAAAN is how do we share these best practices within our advisory networks that can then take them on to the end user, the producer that we work with. Stewardship and protecting the climate cuts across all of our countries, very important for us. And then most recently, everybody's interested in what does a safe, secure, and affordable food system look like? And what is the role of our universities of higher education in agriculture and life sciences to help promote those areas that help feed our country? Next, Rebecca. And so this is kind of the talking slides of why we exist. And one, when we started having these conversations, we don't want to create a new system. We want to be networks to bring people together. We want to identify existing problems and gaps and how we can come together across North America to solve those. And I think the key is implementation. That is something we look at in almost everything we do is how do we get these great practices and great research to be implemented by the ag producer. And then we also want to talk about the return on an increased investment. And some of that investment is not monetarily only. It could be the investment in taking the willingness to change your agricultural practices. It could be an investment of your time to be a part of these greater conversations. And it could be an investment in how do you tie together agricultural research and the innovation of today into the adaptability of producers tomorrow. Next, Rebecca. And so what's our methodology? Well, right now, we actually did a survey with all 3 countries and talked about what does extension do in your country? And if you've been doing this work, all 3 countries' extension systems look differently. And so we wanted to make sure that Mexico and Canada and the United States all answer this question based on the systems that exist. And we are fortunate, we've been extremely blessed in the United States is because of what President Quadrado talked about, some of the foundational commitments of federal funds to our system. We have a very strong and robust cooperative extension system across our country. And You could probably argue pretty effectively it reaches all 3,600 counties to some extent or degree, one or the other. And so we don't want to create new work. We want to create opportunities to enhance what you're doing. And so the first way is to identify shared challenges that we can work on in a collective way across North America, to implement solutions with many partners. And I think what we experienced this past year, and I think what we will see moving forward, is how to bring partnerships together that share this mutual interest in the work that we do. Once again, not trying to create additional work, but enhance what already exists and connect the dots for people to come on board and join us in these critical areas. And then finally, we want to see how we can aggregate and curate the expertise and leadership. The three of our countries have so many great experts out there in research and in extension kind of work. And, most recently in our meetings with Mexico and Canada, we are all dealing with what does artificial intelligence mean, and how do you look at the quality of that, and how can it improve the work that we're doing? How do we look at natural disasters that occur that don't stop at our borders, and drought and wildfires, and sometimes it's the overproduction of water in some areas due to natural events that we have to address together. We talk about how do we do better with educating our students and providing exchanges for researchers and extension faculty between the three countries. What does sustainability really look like? I always go back to a point in time when I started this position. I was at a meeting in Chicago and had a producer that was on a panel, and he said, I can't operate in a green industry if my budget's in the red. And the reality is we've got a lot of really good techniques and applications, but if a producer can't survive financially, they're going to be less adverse to trying that risk if it could cost them a full crop. And so I think NAAAN can help provide that insulation because of good education, outreach through extension. And then I think the leadership is incredible. Independently, our three countries have a lot of expertise in agriculture. Collectively, we have even more. And I think that's one of the goals that we have as we continue to build on the foundations of NAAAN, is how do we can leverage that expertise and learn from each other, what's successful, what are the best practices, and really how do we strengthen all of the food production, food security issues that our countries need for us to be prosperous. Next, Rebecca. And so we tried to boil this down about some of the shared capacities that we have when it comes times to try to address a North American agenda. And it sounds simple, but it can be very challenging for us when we do this because we always will have unique and independent attributes of our countries and what we need in our food supply chain. But if we always talk about how we're different, I think we lose the opportunity to talk about how we're the same. And how do we gain and benefit from this cooperative work together? And so here's just a few ideas that we have talked about in NAAAN and what we want to do. And we can see the highlights about extreme weather events, about preventing the spread of a lot of the diseases and insect vectors we see, the need to kind of stabilize and solve problems that come up very quickly. Great example is the new screwworm issue between Mexico and the United States. We got to move quick to address those kind of issues. And then we also need to realize that, a lot of our farm workers in all three of our countries are actually below the poverty line. And how can we encourage them and lift them up and help them be more successful? It's going to be critical moving forward. And then my last slide, I'd just like to say, we want you to join us. And there's a lot of ways you can join us, but the first is part of this seminar. If you click on the QR code, you can actually join our community that we'll talk more about in a little bit. It's called NAAAN CONNECT. I think, Rebecca, if I'm not mistaken, we are approaching almost over 300 members. Is that a head shake? And continuing to grow on that. We encourage you. There's no commitment. There is no cost, but it's a great connection point. We have some great conversations, and we also try to share best practices and things that we can do together. I see that we got a question from Beverly about examples of cooperation with Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Each of those countries have what we call a country hub. and the Country Hub is responsible for finding those connections that we do. And right now, I think the greatest amount that we see is really an interest in the future of the workforce. In youth programs, Canada started a really successful youth Ag Ambassadors program that we're looking at. Does that apply to the United States? Mexico is really interested in how do we share and adapt to technology and data collection. And I think the biggest challenge we have is how do you separate what's true from what's myth? And there's a lot of that out there. And I know, Beverly, in your role, your group is really tracking where artificial intelligence is going. And in fact, we recently had a conference, and the question is, how do you determine if it's a reliable source? And who's behind what that work that AI is doing? And so there is a lot of challenges. I kind of liken it back to the early days of extension when Google came or search engines came up. They said, well, extension's irrelevant and it's gone. Well, they found very quickly Google can give you a lot of answers, but it can't always give you the correct answer, and they can't answer the follow-up question. And that's what I think we do through higher education: reliable, trusted source, research base, and we keep working until we find a solution. And when I was at the Director of Extension in Texas, a very big system, we like to say that our role was to extend knowledge but provide solutions. So it's got to go hand in hand. And so I'm excited about the future and where we're going. And I know one of the things we want to do with this webinar is get into an interactive discussion. But before I drop the mic, or maybe my last question, I'm excited that President Cruzado is here. And if you listen a little bit to our bylines, we did overlap at Montana State, and I was very honored to work with her there, and now again at APLU. But I would like to, as a new president, President Cruzado, is really what is your vision for APLU's role as a North American higher ed association, and how do you see those connections moving forward?
Oh.
Thank you so much, Carrie. And thank you, Doug. As you can imagine, it's quite an honor for me to be here at APLU, particularly because we have an extraordinary staff like Doug, but also wonderful relationships like with Carrie. Just a little anecdote. About a couple of weeks ago, I was in Mexico for some meetings with the Department of Agriculture, with some sectors of the commerce chambers, etc. And Carrie and I coincided, over a cup of coffee, and what a wonderful opportunity for us to talk about those partnerships into the future. So as for what do I see, what's the vision? First of all, I would love to continue to strengthen every APLU institution, right? This is a time in which universities are looking for expert advice relative to agriculture, relative to governmental affairs, relative to research. And through our network, we are like this wonderful warehouse and repository of what our institutions in America can offer. But what a wonderful experience now also to have an opportunity to strengthen that sense of collaboration with Canadian institutions and with Mexican institutions as well. Another important thing that I see in the future is starting to help APLU institutions galvanizing some of these commitments, right, which are great in theory, and translate that into action. In our conversations with Mexican institutions a couple of weeks ago, that was the main question. So how do we translate these good intentions, these needs, these possible solutions into workable action items that can be implemented, right, throughout the whole membership, and that can result in tangible benefits that then can create this positive alliance of additional member institutions, of additional possible collaborations and partnerships to come into relationship with us. So this is a great time because also there are many things up in the air, right? Starting with AI, some of the big questions in terms of international relationships. This is one of those areas that I feel is protected conversation, and that we look at each other and we recognize we need each other, right? In order to find those solutions, in order to continue to advance research and to promote well-being in our communities as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks for kicking that off. And I think there might be other questions. Highlight, and I see a lot of friends online who were with us for the GFROS annual meeting in Denver in 2023, and thank you for coming back online. That was our first chance to really come together as a network and our first chance to host the GFROS community. I think it's important just to mention that we do say, that we joined a network of 17 others. We are the 18th of the Global Forum for Rural Advisory Services, and there had not yet been a North American voice that was actually participating in that dialogue. And so this and the leadership through APLU, through 4-H, through others that are part of that, are really helping to round it out for us and to take the message of North America Extension and Rural Advisory Services forward in a global context as well. But I see Rebecca's got a hand. Do we have a question, Rebecca?
We have a question and comment from MD Salmon. I wonder if we can identify a common theme for collaboration among the volunteer university members of APLU. The idea would be to work together on specific components of this theme as a demonstration of the value of the proposed network, similar to APLU's 2013 initiative that established higher education hubs in Africa, which were later funded by the World Bank. Carrie may recall this initiative through her previous contact with the World Bank. I suggest that the interaction of food, sustainability, resilience, and health would be a strong starting point.
Thank you. We can throw that back. President Cruzado and Doug, would you like to address that or some of the thoughts you might have around that?
Mm-hmm.
And Doug, you're muted.
Well, I learned long ago when the president's mic comes off first, you allow them to go first.
No, go ahead, Doug. Go ahead, please.
Well, I think it's a great question, and part of the conversations we're having now, and the reason we like these kind of opportunities to interact is collectively think about what are those needs, because there's a lot of things out there, and as I said earlier, I think the biggest need is understanding where those resources are and how we can leverage those to our advantage. And why we have been around for a while now, we have spent the majority of our previous years in building the structure, getting a charter in place, getting kind of how we operate together. And we're now, I believe, in the phase of launching more publicly is how do we build this system out and how do we meet the needs that are already been identified. And we also agree with that comment is we got to be focused. The reality is you can't do everything. And the reality is some people are doing things really well. So if we can learn from them and replicate what they're doing, I think it's to all of our advantage to do that. And you see many association representatives that are part of this webinar because they, I think, very nicely support and the work that we want to do, and we hope we can enhance their work. So I guess it's a long way, as I don't know the answer right now, but I think we are creating a system to come up with those answers. And I'm just gonna, I posted the website in the chat if you've never been there. But I'm also going to post kind of what we say our purpose is and why we come together. And I love it that we say that what we do through NAAAN is 3 countries, but 1 agricultural partnership.
Mm-hmm.
And what we want to do is keep our focus on a North America response to problems that impact all of our countries.
Yeah.
President Cruzado?
Yeah. Now, Doug, well, very well said. Just thinking about this recent trip to Mexico, some of the conversations that we had in an hour and a half with the Secretary of Agriculture, some of the things that were, he was very interested in the questions about the future of livestock production. What about fisheries? What about the ocean, right? The big problems of the ocean at large. Those are some of the scientific questions, but then also, what about the human capacity building? How do we continue to strengthen rural communities? What about indigenous communities? What are some of the areas that through agriculture we can continue to advance? So, as you have said, there are no shortage of opportunities for collaboration. What we need to do is focus, choose one or two, start showing some results, go for the proverbial low-hanging fruit first in order to build trust and to strengthen this alliance that can be so beneficial for the three countries.
That's great. Thank you so much. Let's open it up to questions from the audience, please. And if you're able to come off onto your camera, that'd be lovely. It's great to see your faces. I'll kick it off with one other question I have, just in terms of the public land-grant universities and the federal funding scenario. Has been a long-term relationship for many years. What do you see as sort of private and public sector? What are we beginning to look at? And I know this is an area, especially for the NAAAN, that we're beginning to think about. In our countries each, there are private sector partners who have skin in the game in extension and rural advisory services. And that model varies country by country. But what are some of the thoughts that you as our leadership and then others on the line have around private-public sector and where we should be thinking of steering that in the future?
Yeah, thank you so much, Carrie. And I'm so looking forward to a trip that Doug and I will be making in mid-November so that we can have these conversations with our Canadian partners. I can tell you that in my recent visit to Mexico, what felt different this time, yes, we met with the Secretary of Education, right? We talk about what can the universities do in terms of short-term programs in order to address some of these things. But what was different was the opening of the the Mexican Department of Agriculture, the sharing of the presidential initiatives and the objectives for collaboration. The other thing that was fascinating to me was to have an opportunity to meet with 3 different chambers of commerce and look at them, right, from the possibilities of what are the possibilities and the collaborations with the private sector. How can they come to the table as well? And finally, we had a conversation with officials from Guadalajara, including actually we were at the offices of Tajín, which is this very famous condiment, and they are thinking also in terms of, so what are the possibilities for collaboration, not only as partnerships, but also in terms of philanthropy, right? How can we strengthen each other through the sharing of resources, the identifying of common objectives, and how do we advance the agenda forward?
Would anyone else like to add to that, or your thoughts or experiences in your own programs around private-public sectors partnerships?
Amy, I'm going to call you out. This kind of goes into your comment in the chat box, and I think you're right. I think one of the gaps that we see is connecting the government and NGOs with the work that we're doing. In the United States, we have a lot of challenges right now. We finished a day and a half of meetings, and we walked out of the meeting this morning thinking we have got to help the partnerships that have long known us, but maybe have not supported us, understand the role that we play in the United States. It's a critical role. And so we're going to try to do a better job as we reach out. And it's not just NGOs. It could be an ag federation, a national association. We're going to make an extreme effort to connect back with the commodity groups and especially livestock. And we know all 3 of our countries not just grains, but also livestock are critical, not just to our own food supplies, but to our exports. And we're going to try to reintroduce ourselves to some of the folks that over time we've moved away from.
Thank you.
So Amy, do you want to follow up with your comment?
Offline.
Amy might have stepped away. And I also want to call on her because she's a former Colorado State employee. So
back. We'll see. Any other questions?
oh, okay. Amy says
Is
her
she
mic
here?
won't work.
Oh,
Sorry about that, Amy. You can just chat away in the chat box.
okay. Any other questions for President Cruzado and for Doug? Or thoughts around how we could strengthen this work and our network together? I might call on Angie if we're calling and popcorning, because I just think the work of Eden and the Extension Disaster Education Network, you were with us in GFROS and in Denver, and your work is a beacon of light here in the United States as a model and what we're able to do together. And I know there's interest from our Canadian and our Mexican partners as to how what has worked in the United States and for Eden might actually be something that could translate. So I'm curious what your thoughts are, Angie.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think, sorry, I definitely think there is possibilities for collaboration as well as sharing resources as well. And I will tell you, Carrie, I haven't been able to tell you this yet, that one of the contacts, obviously Norma Samuels works with us here at University of Florida and very involved in GFRAS, but due to those connections that we've made at that meeting in Denver, we have a call with Jamaica trying to understand how best we can support them and their recovery efforts currently. So I do believe that there are areas where we can look at all areas of disaster management, including disaster preparedness and mitigation. But also looking at how can we support and response efforts, and then obviously recovery, because we know how tough recovery is and how long it can be, especially in some of our hard to reach areas. So so I definitely feel like that Eden is primed and ready to expand our wings and reach out into these areas, and we just appreciate being part of the conversation and the collaboration. So
thank you so much. Thank you. We'll go back to if there's no other hands online. I know we have a couple questions in the chat. Rebecca was mentioning who and where are the country hubs, I believe. I'm not sure who asked that question. And the country hubs really are the technical partners and expertise that exists in all of the 3 countries. You know, we're an informal network in that sense that those groups that really want to rise to leadership and would like to work with us, our secretariat is small but mighty and working out of Colorado State University, but we really want to be part of a convening and facilitating the connective tissue. So the hubs are informal and the moderators, we're still working to establish a little bit more of folks moderating Mexico, moderating Canada, and even the United States to start sharing the information. When you get on Connect, you see that we have resources, we have a library, we have opportunities to go a little deeper in our virtual world. And so we would like to up that. It's an inexpensive way to share information and to really be listening to each other and creating a conversation. So it's really TBD, and the things that you all would like to see happen and would like to see move forward, we're open to it, and we can take that to the steering committee and the leadership of the NAAAN to further develop it across the 3 countries. So we look forward to that. Are there other questions from the chat, Rebecca?
We have another question. The current outbreak of New World screwworm in Mexico, along with the threat of its reintroduction into the US, presents an excellent opportunity for collaboration between Mexican and US universities, though unfortunately not including Canadian universities in this case. CAST and USAHA, along with FAO, are already on board.
Okay.
Well, and I believe one of the unrecognized strengths of a North American network is being able to be early detectors when things like this are moving. Extension in all countries, whether it's Extension or an advisory network, they're the boots on the ground. They see these things in real time as they're happening. They give us the opportunity to really jump in earlier before it becomes a problem that can't be maintained or solved. And so I think that is one of the strengths that we look at as a North American, is how do we look at the movement of diseases and pests and things that impact all of our countries and get on the front end of it. And I'm trying to scroll back, so I see a comment about a question above, and I think
there's one about Extension 4.0 and the conference that was just held in Guelph, and I know you were there, Doug.
I was fortunate to be there, and I was fortunate to be part of the panel that talked about the NAAAN and got some great feedback. And it goes back to my earlier comments. We are I think really now in the initial stages of how do we start implementing these discussions. And I like to share with President Cruzado, how do we move from talk to action? And I think we've done everything we do to create a structure that we need to be successful, to have an advisory committee that's extremely responsive. And now is how do you bring in different voices to create the priority programs that are going to be essential for us. And I think the Eden conversation on how we address emergency disasters is critical. I think the conversation on what we do with infectious diseases, I'd like to move beyond just the climate, natural disasters, and pests to how do we improve the quality of soil health, and how do we look at sustainability by producing more with less inputs. The things that our public and land-grant universities across all three countries have done for several decades. And that's what I think the next position point we have is what do we do that can make a difference for all our countries? And in my mind, I think very practically, what I would look at is how do we bring our industry partners on board, especially the different agricultural for-profits that operate in all three countries, and get them to be part of this. How do we provide opportunities for exchange of students and faculty and researchers and extension workers? How do we take on the challenges that are presented with the water quality and the water management issues that all three of our countries face? And one of our big successes with our Canadian partners is when we started our Center for Antimicrobial Resistance. And through our vet schools and College of Agriculture, we had to start addressing the fact that a lot of our animals are becoming resistant to antibiotics. And what does that mean? Along with that, the desire to have less antibiotics in our food supply chain. And so Canadian and U.S. universities, under the direction of Iowa State, have a center of excellence that are now working on that together. And I would like to see that replicated through all of our countries, is where do we get the most benefit and gain by cooperating together.
Excellent, thank you. I did see a question, David Nielsen, who's also part of the NAAAN Secretariat. Are you still online? I believe you're joining. Did you have a question or a comment? There you are.
Yeah, I was going to comment on the Guelph meeting. I see there were a couple people there who were with us. I think Doug responded to that well, but just a more general purpose of that meeting, which was kind of reflected in a lot of people's discussions on the sidelines and in presentations, was the meeting in part was about, well, taking stock of the way extension is organized in Canada now, and having declined quite a bit in terms of the public sector support for extension in the last couple of decades. There was a kind of well, have we gone too far with our pulling back from public sector participation? And, is a more private sector landscape, is that serving the needs, all the needs that the Canadians would like to serve? So I think in terms of NAAAN, I think they really appreciated having a presence in that discussion, but also I think welcomed the possibility of having a little additional discussion with, well, how are things organized and how are they working in Mexico as well as in the US? So I think for the APLU colleagues, you might be helpful in finding people in the US to help join such a discussion, and and the same thing in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, David. President Cruzado, would you like to respond to that or your thoughts?
No, that is an excellent point, David, and that in and of itself, it's a great session for conversation where we should, peel back this onion together with representatives from Canada and with Mexico. What I was thinking, listening to you, is that this is the right people. We have the right profile of individuals in NAAAN and in APLU, because many times when we have these big international conversations, it's very easy for some institutions to retreat and to say, well, if we identify a solution / funder / donor, I'm going to keep it to myself. I'm going to keep it to my own institution, right? And what happens with that is that we all stay at the small level type of solution, and we barely move into implementation. If we're talking about communal problems, big problems demand big solutions, and that will have to be, coming at the table, putting everything on the table and say, we're willing to share expertise, we're willing to share resources, we're willing to share precious time, right, in identifying solutions that will work for all of us, rather than small little opportunities that will not move the needle in the way in which we will need to move the needle in the coming decades in terms of some of these problems.
That's great. Thank you so much. That's excellent. I'm aware of our time. We've got maybe time for another question or so, and then we'll start doing some wrap up. We're going to definitely stay to an hour. Is there someone else who would like to? Bill Hoffman, can I call on you in terms of maybe your thoughts around private-public sector? We have a couple more questions around that. And I know with your background, maybe thinking through what would be examples of private-public sector opportunities that you see. And you're muted.
Sure. I was looking at some opportunities for public sector engagement that we might not have pursued up until now. And the United States imports about $5 billion worth of fertilizer. And we export about $5 billion worth of fertilizer. And we import. And those exports, Canada and Mexico are two of our three largest recipients, and we import about twice that much. And the lion's share of that, or a large share, is potassium that we import from Mexico. And the good thing about soil is that soil is soil in Canada, soil is soil in the United States, and soil is soil in Mexico. And we do a lot of work with soil fertility. And I would think that if we might look to some of these large fertilizer concerns or consortia that might want to tap some of the expertise that we have in soil fertility to not only increase our efficiency, but also as Doug alluded to, making sure that we're looking after soil health as well. So that is kind of what's been rattling around in my brain as far as an area that might be ripe for public and private partnership.
Thank you. Wonderful to think about. I'll put a plug in for all of you to just think about. In 2027 May, the NAAAN leadership just okayed that we can move forward with a convening for the NAAAN for the first time of our three countries coming together we have an invitation from Regina, Saskatchewan, from the Economic Development Group there to host a NAAAN convening in May of 27. We'll have more information out on Connect, but this would be the first time our network can come together since we hosted the GFROS annual meeting in 2023. And those thematic areas that we've discussed today, the areas that have been highlighted for areas of growth, for areas of connectivity, will all be part of the convening programming. So, and we'll be looking for others to help share in the opportunities that we see that should be actually addressed during that convening. So just to flag in whole, May 2027, hopefully with our fundraising and everything else, will be the next convening of the NAAAN and the next opportunity for Canada, Mexico, and the United States to come together. We're also shepherding and considering, as Doug mentioned, one of the ideas is a young professional council, tri-national council across young professionals in the 3 countries. What does that look like to engage and to hear their voices and to have them take on leadership with us? And that's being discussed too. So I think, stay tuned is the message to say, and that in the next year or so, we'll be able to really develop that deeper with all of you. And I definitely want to thank President Cruzado and Vice President Doug Steele for your time and commitment to the NAAAN, for your leadership in helping to guide and direct us. We realize you're about to throw an annual meeting of 1,400 people in Philadelphia, and we are so pleased that you could take some time to spend with us today. And I hope these discussions and others will really continue as we move forward in the months ahead. But I wanted to acknowledge how much time and commitment you are putting in to guiding the NAAAN and helping us through this in the midst of preparing for President Cruzado, your first annual meeting. So a big thank you for that. I'm going to turn the mic over to President Cruzado and Doug Steele to have the last word, please.
Listen, thank you so much, Carrie. Anything for Carrie, anything for Tony Frank. So when they call, I listen, right? Because they have been great partners. And at the end of the day, that is my message to you. This is a great partnership. With your help, it will be even stronger. Please call us. Please reach out to us, to Doug, to Bill. We are here always ready to take your recommendations. Thank you so much to Hector for offering, to serve as intermediary in Mexico through Mexican institutions. That's exactly the spirit that we look forward to continue strengthening now and into the future with this wonderful collaboration with NAAAN. Thank you so much. Some of you, I will see them in Philly for the annual meeting. But thank you for this opportunity, Carrie.
Thank you so much. Doug, thank you. Everyone, thank you for joining us. We'll be thinking about ideas for next year's conversation. Write unto us, write into Rebecca and I. Let us know what you would like us to elevate in terms of future conversations. We're all ears. So thank you so much. Thanks all. Ciao, ciao.